There's something oddly clarifying about airports at dawn. The fluorescent lights, the tired business travelers clutching coffee like it's life support, the shuffle of wheels against tile. It all strips you down to your function. That morning, I was just another mid-level environmental compliance analyst en route to a Vancouver sustainability conference my manager didn't think I should attend. Not client material, he'd said. That phrase stuck like a popcorn kernel between molars. Colin had muttered it half under his breath after a meeting, thinking I'd already left. I hadn't. I stood there with a polite smile frozen on my face, notebook still open, pen uncapped. Not client material, as if I were a defective part on an assembly line. The firm had one remaining pass to the event, and I fought for it the only way I knew how. By citing precedent, policy, and profit. I had supported 4 major renewables accounts last year. I had corrected a misfiling in the state-level compliance chain that saved a client 6 figures in fines. I didn't raise my voice or pull rank. I made a spreadsheet and submitted a memo. Colin approved my attendance with a dismissive, "Fine." I didn't mind the red eye. It meant fewer people, less pressure to perform social rituals. The seat assignment came as a surprise. 3A, business class. Likely a clerical fluke or unfilled upgrade. I'd barely settled in when a woman in a crisp gray pantsuit sat beside me. She had a face I half recognized from shareholder letters and green energy expos. "Jeanette Lively," she said after fastening her seatbelt. "Lively Energy?" The Lively Energy, one of our firm's biggest clients. I'd reviewed emissions metrics for 2 of their offshore projects last fall. Colin had done the presentations, of course. I was just support. I nodded, trying not to look startled. "Mira Anand," I replied. "Environmental analyst, Pender and Rourke." Her eyes flicked sideways. "Colin's firm." "Yes." For a few minutes, we let the ambient hum of the plane fill the silence. I didn't expect a conversation, nor did I want one. But 30 minutes into the flight, somewhere over Oregon, she glanced at the data dashboard on her tablet and muttered, "These offsets don't add up." I didn't mean to look, but my gaze must have lingered because she angled the screen slightly toward me. "Mind if I ask something?" she said. I hesitated. "Of course not." She pointed to the carbon offset chart tied to one of her newer solar subsidiaries. "How would you verify this?" I took a breath. The offset assumptions look like they're based on Tier 2 modeling. They're fine in principle, but if the farm is in a mixed wetland area, they'll be out of date within 6 months. I'd run a shadow audit with local emission data, then compare that to the National Registry for deviations. She looked at me, really looked, then leaned back in her seat. "Colin never mentioned anyone with that kind of lens on his team." I gave a tight smile. "I work more behind the scenes." We didn't speak for a while after that, but I caught her glancing at me again during the descent. Before we landed, she handed me her card. No comment. Just a small nod, like an unspoken handshake. I tucked it into my notebook. By the time we deplaned, I'd almost convinced myself the exchange had meant nothing. But something about her expression told me it had meant everything. At that point, I still didn't realize the flight wasn't the beginning of a coincidence. It was the start of a reckoning. I didn't enter environmental law for the prestige. No one does. It's a quiet field, lined with policy updates, regulatory acronyms, and the dull hum of procedural diligence. But I liked it. There was comfort in clarity, in building something solid and verifiable from legal scaffolding and scientific data. I joined Pender and Rourke 6 years ago, straight out of Berkeley's graduate environmental law program. Back then, the firm still had some of its scrappy idealism. Boutique-sized, urban-focused, consulting with a conscience. That changed after we landed our first major renewable energy account. Suddenly, the language around the office shifted. We weren't advocates anymore. We were partners in growth. Colin Rourke came in 2 years after I did. Fast talker, always in motion, always holding a phone like it might vanish if he didn't. He wore tailored suits and kept a standing lunch with board members, always off the record. His brand was executive Polish, and he cultivated it like a vineyard. From the beginning, he made his impressions quickly. He liked charisma, showmanship, energy. In meetings, I watched how he locked onto the loudest voice, the most confident tone, regardless of content. People like me, who took time to think before speaking, didn't register. That first year under him, I presented a review on a client's water rights compliance. It was meticulous, even a bit overbuilt. Citations, code references, GIS overlays. Colin skimmed it and said, "Good technical notes. I'll translate this into something client-ready." I nodded, but I remember the twist in my stomach. I hadn't written it in Swahili. It was client-ready, just not in his dialect. I began noticing patterns. I was never introduced by name on calls. My bullet points appeared on his slides, stripped of their nuance. In one particularly blatant instance, I recognized a paragraph in his client memo, lifted verbatim from a briefing I'd written. But my name had been swapped for his junior associate's. When I raised it, he smiled. "Don't worry, Mira. It's all the firm's work. We're a team." Team. I stopped expecting credit and focused on consistency. If I couldn't be seen, I could at least be right. But there was another side to it. Being overlooked gave me freedom. I could attend meetings silently, absorbing the power plays, the hedged language, the way numbers were massaged into palatability. I became fluent in subtext. Colin would lean on consultants to soften emissions forecasts. He'd shave down penalties in internal drafts to make clients feel reassured. He wasn't breaking laws, not exactly. He was bending them with plausible deniability. Still, it gnawed at me. There were lines that shouldn't be blurred, especially not when communities downstream or downwind bore the brunt of those decisions. The conference in Vancouver was one of the few things I pushed for. The theme was sustainable accountability, a topic squarely in my lane. I drafted a proposal, attached my prior research, cross-referenced with our client portfolio. HR approved the expense, but Colin dragged his feet. The day he said yes, he dropped the words like lint. "I just don't see you as client material, Mira, but go if you want to." He meant it as an offhand comment. But in a way, it was the most direct thing he'd ever said to me. I wasn't glossy enough, loud enough, Western enough. I didn't move like someone trying to impress a room. I moved like someone trying to understand it. Still, I'd built quiet influence. Internally, people sent me their trickiest filings. Regulatory staff trusted my analysis. I helped a junior associate spot a critical permitting error before it hit submission. I trained our newest hire on how to interpret regional carbon data without defaulting to national averages, something even our senior consultants got wrong. But none of it mattered in Colin's version of the firm. He didn't yell. He didn't harass. He simply made you feel like you weren't built for the spotlight. Like your ideas were too dense, your sentences too measured, your presence too subtle. The irony was, most of our clients operated in spaces that required exactly that kind of thinking. They needed precision, integrity, patience. What they got instead was a narrative, curated by Colin and sold with charm. I didn't resent him. Not really. I knew how systems worked. I was a woman of color in a field where credibility still leaned heavily on image. I spoke carefully. I wore neutral tones. I kept records. But sitting next to Jeanette on that flight, something shifted. I hadn't pitched myself. I hadn't polished a speech or angled for visibility. I just answered a question honestly, the same way I would in a briefing. And it was that moment, that quiet moment, that registered with her. When she looked at me again during landing, it wasn't with curiosity. It was with calculation. She had seen something Colin never bothered to. And whether she meant to or not, she had set something in motion. To understand Colin Rourke, you had to accept a certain truth. He was never playing checkers. He was always playing chess, but the kind where he moved the pieces during your turn and smiled like he was helping. His entire method revolved around perception management. He didn't manipulate with lies. He curated with omissions. He was masterful at crafting an executive version of the truth, one that made clients feel heard, reassured, and vaguely superior. And he'd built his career on the assumption that details were flexible and memory was short. Colin didn't understand data, not really. He didn't need to. He understood people. He knew how to modulate his tone depending on whether a client was from Calgary or Palo Alto. He was fluent in buzzwords: decarbonization pathway, regulatory delta, audit-forward accountability. Words that sounded rigorous but meant nothing if not anchored to the underlying science, which of course he never quite bothered to learn. Most of my time under Colin involved producing airtight analyses that he'd skim at best, discard at worst. His favorite move was to ask for a simplified summary for the deck, then edit it into something palatable, never inaccurate enough to be illegal, but slippery enough to be misinterpreted. I learned early on that what I submitted and what he sent out were often distant cousins. In one instance, I'd written a compliance briefing for a client whose offshore turbines had triggered unexpected migratory disruption to a protected bird species. I'd included mitigation strategies, one of which required temporary suspension of 2 units. In Colin's version of the document, the word suspension vanished. So did any mention of compliance risk. Instead, it became a monitoring recommendation. When I confronted him, he chuckled. "You have to understand, Mira. Clients want solutions, not scare tactics." It was a convenient philosophy, one that allowed him to cut corners without ever acknowledging they were corners in the first place. And it worked, because he knew the odds. Most clients didn't dig into the raw reports. They scanned summaries, trusted branding, and assumed technical compliance was someone else's problem. Colin was careful not to put anything overtly dishonest in writing. He was a connoisseur of plausible deniability. Every email had just enough ambiguity to give him room to pivot. If something went wrong, there'd be a memo referencing adaptive timelines or expected regulatory flux. You couldn't pin him to a wall because he never stood still long enough. And it wasn't just clients. Inside the firm, Colin had a core group of acolytes, junior consultants who admired his Polish and tried to mimic his style. They dressed like him, spoke in clipped jargon, deferred to him on every call. I watched them rise faster than their work warranted, rewarded more for enthusiasm than expertise. It wasn't malicious, at least not on the surface. It was systemic. They played the game as it had been modeled, look the part, say the right things, keep everything upbeat and under control. What I never got used to was the slow erosion of meaning. Words I'd spent hours defining precisely would be diluted, reworded, rearranged. A section on groundwater toxicity thresholds would become potential impact zone. A mitigation cost estimate flagged as critical would be relabeled budget-sensitive recommendation. Over time, I began saving 2 versions of every report, the original and the colonized one. I never said anything. I wasn't looking for a fight. But I kept them. Out of principle, out of habit, maybe out of quiet defiance. Occasionally, clients would email follow-up questions, confused by the contradictions. That's when Colin would forward me the thread with a single line. "Can you clean this up?" And I would. Because it was easier than challenging the process. Because I didn't want to be labeled difficult. Because I still hoped that doing the work right would eventually matter. The irony, of course, was that Colin relied on people like me. He needed technical staff who understood the law, the science, the stakes. He needed people to produce the substance he could then smooth into a pitch. But he'd never acknowledge that. His image required a mythology, that he was the visionary, and the rest of us were interchangeable support. It wasn't that he thought I was wrong. He just thought I didn't sell, that I wasn't good for the brand. But what Colin failed to understand, what he'd always failed to understand, was that in our field, credibility wasn't a look. It was a record, and records once created don't vanish. They sit there, time-stamped and archived, waiting for the moment someone finally decides to look closely. After the flight, I had the growing sense that someone was about to. The email arrived 3 days after the flight. It was short, polite, and perfectly neutral, the kind that reveals nothing unless you know what to read for. Subject: follow-up, emissions metrics, Pender and Rourke. Hi Mira, following our conversation on the flight, I'd appreciate a quick clarification regarding the offset assumptions used in the 2023 Q3 report for Ridgewater Solar. Specifically, the projection model reference doesn't seem to match the regional benchmarks. Can you confirm methodology? Best, Jeanette. There was no CC, no assistant looped in. Just her to me. Director. I reread it 3 times, heartbeat quickening. She remembered. Not just me, the exact report, the metrics, the model. I felt the weight of it immediately. A quiet probe wrapped in corporate decorum. I stared at the screen, then minimized the window. I needed to think. I knew better than to reply off the cuff. Any data Jeanette referenced would have been signed off under Colin's name, filtered, packaged, and presented with his signature varnish. If I confirmed discrepancies too openly, I'd be undermining the firm. If I ignored her, I'd confirm her suspicion. I waited an hour before drafting a reply. I used careful language. Hi Jeanette, thank you for following up. The Q3 Ridgewater model was originally benchmarked against the 2022 National Index, then localized using interpolated wetland factors. I'd be happy to walk you through the methodological breakdown. Best, Mira. I sent it. Within minutes, she responded. Let's set a time. Tomorrow 10 a.m. PST. It wasn't a request. When I told Colin I'd received a follow-up from Jeanette, his eyes narrowed just slightly. She contacted you? She had a question about Ridgewater, I said. Something we discussed on the flight. He smiled, tight and controlled. Of course. Loop me in when you speak. It wasn't a suggestion either. At 10:02 a.m. the next morning, I clicked into the Zoom room. Jeanette was already there. So was Colin. What followed was 30 minutes of restrained professional theater. Jeanette asked questions, calmly, directly. I answered with just enough precision to be accurate but not accusatory. Colin added flourishes, emphasizing how transparent and adaptable our process was. But Jeanette wasn't smiling. She took notes. She asked about timestamps. She used phrases like review alignment and source audit. She was building something. After the call, Colin pulled me into his office. Let me be clear, Mira. If a client reaches out to you directly, you loop me in before you reply. Understood? I nodded. And let's not over-intellectualize this. She's kicking tires. Just give her what she wants and keep it clean. He didn't yell. He didn't even sound angry. He sounded uneasy, like something had slipped out of his grasp and he wasn't sure what yet. That afternoon, Jeanette's team formally requested the underlying datasets and logs from the Ridgewater Q3 analysis. For cross-reference, they said. Not unusual in isolation. But then came a second request for documentation from 3 other projects handled under Colin's purview. By the end of the week, internal compliance had flagged the inquiry for client-tier attention. A quiet alert, not a fire, but smoke. Colin kept things light in meetings, joked about being under the microscope, said, "Hey, if they want to pay us to triple-check our own work, I'm all for it." But I saw it in his posture. He was leaning forward more, clicking his pen, making calls from behind closed doors. What he didn't do was involve me. I watched from the periphery as he started directing junior staff to re-verify old filings, calling in favors from his loyal circle to paper over anything that might appear inconsistent. But it was too late for that. Jeanette wasn't looking for reassurances. She was checking the ledger. And somehow, without intending to, I had become part of the audit trail. The thing about systems is, they record everything. You just have to know where to look and how long you're willing to keep looking. I started by pulling my original Ridgewater draft from the firm's internal archive. The metadata showed a last modified timestamp from my account, 3 days before submission. Colin's version, the one sent to Jeanette's team, had no author attribution in the header. Just the firm logo, his signature block, and a cheerful executive summary that read more like a press release than a compliance document. I laid the two versions side by side. In my draft, there was a full breakdown of local emissions variance across Ridgewater's development zone, flagged with 3 risk annotations: potential over-reporting of carbon absorption, unresolved permit ambiguity for wetland disturbance, and an errant Tier 3 contractor summary with missing disposal records. Not exactly scandalous, but enough to warrant caution. In the final version, all 3 notes were gone. The projected offset number had been raised by 6%. No footnotes, no revised data justifying the change. Just higher numbers and a more optimistic tone. The pattern wasn't hard to spot once I stopped pretending it was a one-off. Over the next 2 weeks, I reviewed 6 projects I'd worked on under Colin. In every case, there were subtle edits, always in the same direction: risks downplayed, numbers smoothed, footnotes trimmed or dropped entirely. The changes were never drastic, never enough to trip regulatory alarms, but they told a story, a deliberate one. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not my colleagues, not my manager, not even my closest friend on the compliance team. I needed time to be sure, and more importantly, I needed to follow procedure. If I raised alarms prematurely, Colin could spin it, make me look paranoid, bitter, insubordinate. I knew how easily perception became fact in places like this. So I documented everything. I logged file versions. I exported change histories. I printed time-stamped drafts and backed them up on encrypted storage. I built a spreadsheet mapping original figures against final deliverables, noting the deviations in tone, scope, and numerical values. Each project became a case study, not of fraud, but of a practiced erosion of integrity. Still, I wasn't out for blood. I wasn't even sure what I was out for. Justice, maybe. Or something smaller but more stubborn. The refusal to be made complicit. At night, I reread the firm's internal ethics policy. We had a clause, barely enforced, often ignored, that allowed staff to file integrity memos when client-facing materials diverged substantially from internal recommendations. It was designed for whistleblowing without the headlines. A procedural pressure valve. If used right, it triggered an internal review that couldn't be quietly dismissed. I drafted my first memo in silence, after midnight. I attached 3 project comparisons, a note on methodology, and a brief neutral summary. Documented discrepancies between internal compliance drafts and submitted materials for client accounts. I didn't name Colin. I didn't speculate on intent. I let the data speak. I didn't submit it. Not yet. Because I knew what would happen next. Jeanette's team would start asking questions our records couldn't answer. And when that time came, I wanted to be ready. Not just to respond, but to guide. So I did something harder than calling it out. I waited. And I kept building. One night, alone in the office, well past hours, I pulled the original filings from the Quarter Hill wind account. A project I remembered well. We'd flagged a migratory impact risk due to seasonal wind patterns. My report had included suggested turbine pauses during nesting season to mitigate the effect. It had been carefully worded, backed by research from the Fish and Wildlife Service. In the final version, that section had been removed. Colin had replaced it with a general statement about sustained environmental harmony. Environmental harmony. I stared at the phrase like it had teeth. A poetic nothing. Language designed to soothe, not solve. I highlighted it, printed it, filed it. This wasn't about catching someone in the act. It was about proving that the act had become routine. When Jeanette's office sent another request, this time for source documentation corresponding to migratory modeling, I knew the moment had arrived. Not a confrontation, a calibration. I filed the integrity memo at 6:17 p.m. on a Thursday. By 8:40 a.m., Friday, I received a calendar invite. Internal Review Committee. Monday morning. No agenda attached. The machinery had begun to move, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer quietly working under a system. I was finally working through it. The conference room smelled like lemon disinfectant and tension. 3 partners sat at the far end of the table, corporate counsel to their left, and Colin directly across from me. The blinds were drawn. The windows faced nothing in particular. I had been in this room before, for quarterly updates, policy briefings, end-of-year wrap-ups. But this wasn't any of those. This was a review. They called it that. Not a hearing, not an inquiry. A review, as if it were routine. They opened with questions, neutral, procedural. Can you walk us through your memo? What methodology did you use to compare drafts? I kept my answers dry and professional. Facts, dates, versions, nothing interpretive. Then they turned to Colin. He smiled. Not the full version, just the restrained one he used when someone challenged his authority, and he had to pretend he wasn't threatened. Let me start by saying that Mira is one of our most diligent analysts. Her attention to detail is unmatched. If anything, she errs on the side of overflagging. He used that word again. Overflagging. Not wrong, just too thorough, too academic, too cautious. He continued, explaining how, in a high-speed client environment, reports often need executive refinement to focus on actionable insights. He leaned into the language, operational efficiency, stakeholder clarity, communicative balance. He didn't deny the edits. He framed them as enhancements. You have to understand, he said, glancing toward the partners. Clients aren't looking for technical Bibles. They want clarity. They want solutions. We translate the data into something usable. That's the service. No one challenged him directly. Not yet. One of the partners nodded. Another scribbled something in a notebook. I knew how this would go. I wasn't being accused. I was being reframed as smart but naive. A gifted technician who didn't grasp the broader context. I was being cast as the rain cloud over the parade. A distraction, an internal memo. But I also knew something else. The firm's counsel leaned forward. Mira, did you ever raise concerns about these discrepancies prior to the memo? Careful now. Yes, I said. In informal channels. I flagged inconsistencies when I saw them, though not through formal policy until now. Any response from management? Nothing in writing. That was the truth. And in this room, truth wasn't just a virtue. It was a lever. Colin sighed audibly. Look, I think we're all aligned here. No one's disputing Mira's accuracy. But intent matters. There was no malice, no deception. Just streamlining. It's important we don't criminalize adaptation. He paused, scanning the room. Let's not burn down the barn because someone found a crooked nail. He was good. I'll give him that. But something shifted when counsel pulled up a slide on the screen. 2 nearly identical charts. One from my draft, one from the final submission. Side by side, the changes were impossible to ignore. The edits weren't random. They were strategic. Every risk minimized. Every doubt reworded into optimism. What would you call this, Mr. Rourke? Counsel asked. Colin hesitated. A flicker, half a second. An attempt to present the data in a digestible format. And why was the risk assessment removed? I made an editorial judgment, he said, still smiling. But the smile was smaller now. For the first time, I saw his footing shift. They didn't ask for my interpretation. They didn't need to. My work stood on its own. I hadn't made a case. I'd shown the record. And that, it turned out, was enough. When the meeting ended, no decisions were announced, no verdicts. Just a thank you and a vague promise to continue reviewing the matter. Colin didn't speak to me as we left the room, but as the door clicked shut behind me, I felt the shift. The story he'd been telling, about how the firm worked, about who had value, had cracked. And this time, the data had spoken louder than the narrative. The first thing I noticed was that the emails got quieter. Not silent, not suspiciously so, just more measured. Fewer exclamation marks, fewer half-jokes in the subject lines, the kind of cautious professionalism that creeps in when people sense scrutiny, but don't know where it's coming from. The second thing I noticed was that Jeanette hadn't disappeared. In fact, she'd grown more visible. Her team began looping me into technical reviews without going through Colin. Sometimes it was framed as a clarification. Sometimes it was nothing more than, "Mira, what's your take?" But the message was clear. They trusted my language more than his. I didn't gloat. I didn't overstep. I answered questions. I cited policy. I kept everything public, documented, and neutral. What I did do quietly was suggest a new compliance structure, not as an indictment of the old one, but as a response to the gaps now too obvious to ignore. I proposed a dual sign-off system for all emissions impact summaries and recommended a return to full transparency logs, with edits tracked in version control software, not buried in PDFs. Jeanette's team didn't just listen. They adopted it. She even mentioned, in a brief internal call, that Mira's framing provides the clarity we've been missing. That was it. No ceremony. No announcement. Just the CEO of a major renewable firm echoing a phrase I'd written 2 weeks earlier. Colin, meanwhile, was slipping. He was still coming to meetings, still cracking jokes, still pretending nothing had changed. But the mask was fraying. I caught him misquoting a regional policy during a partner call. He corrected himself immediately, of course, but not before I saw the flicker of irritation in Jeanette's eyes. She noticed, and the rest of the firm noticed her noticing. When clients start looking over your shoulder, the illusion of control collapses fast. There was a Monday morning when I found a post-it on my desk, unsigned, just a scrawl of ink that read, "Don't let them pin this on you." I didn't know who left it. Maybe no one. Maybe it was just someone's guilt trying to shed its skin. But it told me something. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the internal complication. I was becoming the internal compass. Still, I wasn't interested in revenge. There was no satisfaction in watching someone squirm. I didn't want Colin punished. I wanted the culture that enabled him corrected. There's a difference. That difference became leverage. I drafted a final summary of discrepancies across 5 client reports. I flagged areas for audit exposure and included proposed remediation language that would protect the firm, align with client expectations, and avoid litigation. I sent it not to HR, not to internal review, but directly to the partners. Subject line: mitigation pathways, summary for executive review. I received 3 replies in under 10 minutes. Colin was not copied on any of them. That week, Jeanette initiated a full third-party audit of her firm's partnership with Pender and Rourke. Not hostile, not dramatic, just thorough. She used words like alignment, due diligence, process reconciliation. Her tone was measured, but her intent wasn't. She was shifting vendors, or more precisely, she was shifting trust. A partner pulled me aside quietly one evening, in the kitchen no less. The most human setting possible in a building made of glass and performance. He said, "We appreciate your discretion through all this." Discretion, as if silence were my virtue. But it wasn't silence. It was strategy. And it had worked. Not because I was louder, but because I had the truth. And I used it properly. The announcement came quietly, as they always do when the real decision has already been made behind closed doors. Effective next quarter, Colin Rourke will be transitioning into a strategic advisory role with the firm. focused on business development and external relations. No meeting, no applause, just a 6-sentence email with carefully chosen language. Transitioning, advisory, strategic. Corporate synonyms for sidelined. He wasn't fired. Of course not. That would have made noise. It would have invited questions. Instead, he was moved into a role where he could cause less harm. No more data to alter, no more reports to reframe. Just lunches, LinkedIn updates, and fading influence. Colin didn't speak to me in the days after. He passed me twice in the hallway. Once, he nodded without expression. The second time, he kept walking. And that was that. I wasn't promoted. There was no title change, no ceremonial elevation. But I didn't need one. What I got was quieter, but far more valuable. Access. Suddenly, I was being invited to internal calibration meetings with client strategy teams. Compliance officers asked for my input before reports went out. Junior analysts sought me out, not just for technical questions, but for mentorship. They'd start with, "Hey, I heard you might know how to..." And then it would trail into something real, something difficult. A modeling inconsistency, a regulatory gray zone, a line they weren't sure they could ethically cross. And they knew I'd answer. Not with a lecture, not with fear, but with facts, patience, and policy. One afternoon, our managing partner asked if I'd consider acting as a liaison with Lively Energy's new compliance board. "They've made it clear they'd prefer continuity," he said, "and they specifically asked for you." That was the first time I felt it. Not validation exactly, but relief. That maybe I hadn't been shouting into a void all this time. That someone somewhere had been listening. My new role wasn't glamorous. It wasn't designed for public recognition. But it was full of substance. I was tasked with drafting a new internal review process that balanced legal rigor with client transparency. It was buried in documents and protocols and long conversations with people who actually cared about getting it right. It was perfect. And perhaps most satisfying of all, it was mine. One evening, I stayed late to finalize a carbon reporting framework for a new hydropower site in British Columbia. As I walked past the empty offices, I paused outside the corner suite that used to belong to Colin. It was dark, stripped bare. Just a desk, a lamp, and a view of a skyline that no longer reflected him. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was something simpler. Peace. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't compromised. I hadn't retaliated, schemed, or performed. I'd done what I always did, followed the rules, trusted the data, and waited. The firm hadn't changed overnight. The culture was still full of unspoken hierarchies and inherited biases. But now, there was a precedent. A different example. A new, quiet voice in the room, no longer ignored. And that was enough. For now. A few months later, I was standing by the office coffee machine when Anya, one of our newer analysts, approached me. She was smart, sharp-eyed, methodical, still learning how to speak up in rooms that didn't expect her to. I saw pieces of my younger self in her, the version that still assumed competence would be obvious if you just kept your head down and delivered. "Can I ask you something?" she said, voice low but firm. I nodded. "How did you shift things? I mean, how did you change the way they look at you? At what you do?" I understood what she was really asking. How do you go from invisible to indispensable without selling out what matters? How do you survive a system without letting it remake you? I thought for a moment, then answered simply. I didn't change anything. I just followed the rules better than they did. She smiled. Not a full grin, more a soft exhale of recognition. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was a true one. And sometimes, truth is enough to start with. Later that week, she sent me a draft report she'd been working on. It was solid, precise, but cautious in its recommendations. I offered a few edits, then wrote in the comments. You don't need to soften facts. State them plainly. Integrity isn't a tone. She didn't reply. But a week later, I saw her defend one of her projections in a stakeholder call. Gently, firmly, without apology. That, I thought, is how it starts. We like to imagine power as something dramatic. A speech, a firing, a shakeup. But the real kind is quieter. It's found in corrections that hold, in standards that don't bend, in the email someone thinks twice about sending because they know you're watching. It's found in precedent. I never became the kind of leader who commands rooms. I don't have the voice for it, or the hunger. But what I have now is influence. It moves differently. Not as force, but as weight. It enters a conversation when I speak, even softly. It holds the table still. I still think about that flight sometimes, about how a chance seating arrangement became the fulcrum of everything that followed. Not because I made a pitch or staged a moment, but because I showed up as I was, with what I knew, and trusted that it might one day matter. That's what people like Colin never understood. Power isn't in how loudly you speak. It's in how accurately you're heard when it finally matters. There are still battles ahead. More friction. More ambiguity. Not every system wants to be corrected, and not every voice gets a seat at the table just because it's earned. But I've learned that change, real change, doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it begins in the footnotes, in the version control logs, in the parts of the system no one thought anyone was watching. Until someone does. And when they do, quietly and methodically, the truth has its own gravity. All you have to do is hold the line.